Good afternoon. I feel I've kind of finally arrived because here I am sandwiched between two of the rock stars of the Catholic Church. On the one side, Cardinal Chambon, on the other, Father Michael Gately. I can share a little bit in the rock star status because I have my Madonna microphone on. Apparently this is called a Madonna microphone, and I don't think it's named after our Blessed Mother. Okay, good. Just one tip. You just come back from lunch. If you're going to fall asleep or doze, I'd prefer you do it in the first 20 minutes rather than the last 20. I'd rather you didn't do it. But if you must, the last 20 minutes I think is more significant. Yeah? So there we are, at least to give you that option. Okay. Hardly a month goes by these days without an email dropping into my inbox asking me to sign a petition against something like some directive from the EU to make LGBT awareness classes compulsory in primary school, or maybe from the United Kingdom, where they're introducing the study of the Kama Sutra into primary schools, or something like this. And normally the complaint of the persons who would like me to sign their petition is that this goes against the principle of the parents as the primary educator of the children. It's very well known, of course, that the Catholic Church holds that the primary purpose of marriage is the procreation and the education of children. But if you think about the defense of that couplet, procreation, education of children, it's very much been skewed in the last 30, 40 years towards the procreative dimension. You only have to think somebody like John Paul II dedicated the first 5 years of his pontificate in his weekly catechesis to a defense of the procreative end of the marital act. Now, he did write a little bit on the educative part of the couplet, but very limited way, just a few paragraphs in Familiaris Consortio, some things in the Letter to Families and in the Charter of the Rights of the Family. But if you really want to get an exposition of the parent as the primary educator, you've got to go back nearly 85 years to 1929 and Pius XI's Divini Ilius Magistri. And yet, in that time, the modern state has more and more claimed that it is the primary educator of children. And the Church's teaching is really now, I would say, more or less in quite strong conflict in many states, at least. I'm talking particularly from a European perspective. The Church's teaching butts against certain attitudes of the state. It's not just about compulsory sex education or negative sex education in schools. It would also include the fact that in many countries in Europe, home education is illegal. In about half of all European countries, educating your children at home is a criminal offense. So particularly strong examples of this are Germany and Sweden, where parents do go to prison if they persist in that form of educating their children. Even in more liberal countries, liberal in this particular area, say the United Kingdom and Ireland, who in fact enshrine the right to home education in the Constitution, it's a complete sideshow and seen as a rather quirky approach to education and tolerated certainly for the sake maybe of greater liberties, but seen, I think, in a rather sort of poor light. So it seems to me that it would be timely just to consider this question then of what it means to say that the parents are the primary educators. And I want to do that in 3 steps. First of all, I want to say something about the origin of that principle, that the parents are primary educators. Say something of the scope or extent. What does it really mean to say such a thing? And finally, to say something about the significance of it at this time, the significance of affirming it at this time. So if that's okay with you, that's my structure. And if it's not okay with you, well, there's not much I can do about that. Okay. The source of the parents' right as primary educators is very straightforward. The parents began the process of conferring life, and therefore they are the ones who ultimately should bring it to fruition. Just as a priest's job does not end at baptism, nor a doctor's job at the resuscitation of their patient, so the job of the parents to form life does not end at the moment of conception or at birth. Now, of course, this isn't the thing you would ever say to a woman who's just struggled through 20 hours of labor, but it is true that she has only just begun to give life to her child. because we think of life not in this kind of binary concept, but as something which can be more and more. And therefore, having begun the process of life, it's the parents, not the neighbors, not the scout group, not the state, which have the primary responsibility to bring it to fruition. We could also say that the children belong to the parents in a unique way. Now, if I use the word like belonging, that can make some people nervous because it can seem to be rather despotic. You know, my car belongs to me, my laptop belongs to me. But here, by the word belong, we mean the belonging, for example, that's true between a husband and a wife. I am my beloved's, and she is mine, says the Song of Songs. This belonging is not, this is mine and I can do what I want with it, but this is someone I have serious obligations towards. And so the founding point of the right to educate children is that there's a duty to educate them, which resides principally with the parents. All true rights are founded on some duty. If you want a litmus test to sift out fake rights, and there are a lot of fake rights out there, it will be a right that has no corresponding duty to it. It's the strong obligation that the parents have towards the education of their children that gives them the ultimate right to do it. Thirdly, the parents have a unique aptitude for the job. The right flows from an ability to do it. They have a natural affection for the children, which breeds a certain solicitude. In fact, the affection between a parent and a child is naturally stronger than between spouses, because they are more part of the parent than one spouse is part of the other. So that gives a natural solicitude, and it also generates a natural authority. The child naturally turns to the parent in terms of a source of authority. So on the basis of affection, solicitude, and authority, the parent has a particular aptitude for the job, and therefore the right to do it. Pius says that education is what's needed essentially in education is a soul-to-soul connect between the teacher and the pupil. It's a heart speaks to heart experience. And the parent in particular has that by nature and therefore has the right to do it. Of course, they are made supernaturally apt to do it through the sacrament of holy matrimony. So not only do they have a natural aptitude, but unlike the neighbor, unlike the state, unlike the scout group, they have a supernatural aptitude as well. Okay, so much for the basis of this right. I'd like to spend some time now looking at the meaning of it, or the extent of it. What do we really mean when we say the parents are primary educators? And I'm going to do that by looking at the word primary and the word educator. And it seems better to go with the noun first, and then I'll come to the adjective. It seems logical, which will satisfy me. The educator, of course, is the person who guides the process of education. So the question before us is, what is the process of education? Unfortunately, Pius, in Divini Ilius Magistri, gives us a very clear definition of that. He says, education consists essentially in preparing man for what he must be and for what he must do here below in order to attain the sublime end for which he was created. It's a very nice, pithy definition. Education consists essentially in preparing a man for what he must be and for what he must do here below in order to obtain the sublime end for which he was created. So we see education has a natural end and it has a supernatural end, and there's a hierarchy between these two ends. So we need to look at those a little bit to understand the whole scope of education. The natural end of education, education at a natural level, is the acquisition of virtue. The acquisition of moral virtue and the acquisition of intellectual virtue. The acquisition of moral virtue, principally the cardinal virtues, which are good character. If you want good character in your child, it means you want them to have the cardinal virtues. But it also includes the intellectual virtues, knowledge of science, biology, languages, and all these other things which are necessary. However, it seems to me it would be wrong to reduce education at a natural level simply to equipping somebody to get a job. This is definitely not Pius's approach. He thinks it terminates in a vocation. At a natural level, the purpose of education is to equip somebody to take up their vocation in this life, which for the vast majority of children is going to be a spouse and to be a parent. And therefore, this is the first, as it were, a goal of the parent, is to make a disciple, somebody who will also be a good parent. Getting a job is normally necessary to be a parent because you need a job in order to found a family. But it's definitely in this order. Vocation is the principle. Equipping somebody to get a job is ordered towards them fulfilling that vocation. At a supernatural level, we see that education must include some religious formation because, as he says, education consists in preparing a man for what he must be and for what he must do here below in order that he may attain the sublime end for which he was created. Therefore, to exclude religious education from education is to basically deform education, period. It would be like teaching somebody to cook and only teach them how to make the dough, knead the dough, but never how to bake the bread. Yeah? It would be worse than a half-baked form of education. However, this education is not only religious, but to be truly education, it has to be Christian. Listen to this quote. It's rather startling, but it's again, following on from the quote I just read. It is clear that there can be no education which is not wholly directed to man's last end, and that in this present order of providence, since God has revealed himself to us in the person of his only begotten Son, who alone is the way, truth, and life, there can be no ideally perfect education which is not Christian education. Pius really is saying all education which is not Christian education is radically foreshortened. Yeah, it's a startling truth, but if you think about what we're up to, we're trying to get children to attain their purpose. Education which is not Christian must be defective at some level. Okay, initial conclusion. All aspects of education, physical, the moral, the intellectual, and the spiritual, fall into the lap of the parents. They are responsible ultimately for all of it. Why? Because they give birth to a person. They don't give birth to an intellect or a body or a will or a sensitive appetite. They give birth to a person, and therefore they have the responsibility for the whole person. The second reason why the parent has responsibility for all of this is that the truth is one, seamless. That's not surprising when you think where it comes from. It comes from God himself, who is utterly simple, without complexity. It would be a waste of time, in a way, for some parent to pay attention only to the intellectual formation of their child, or only to the moral, or only to the spiritual formation. If parents are not interested in what the child is taught in history, or literature, or biology and how it relates to the human person, or in philosophy, what worldview it gives, there's no way they can protect and perfect the moral and spiritual formation of the child. For a parent to only take control of the moral or spiritual formation of a child is to lose even those. Yeah? So the obligation is a very complete obligation. Okay, let's look at the word primary. The word primary can be taken in at least 4 ways, but only 1 or 2 are of particular interest to us, but I'll mention the others for completeness. Because we're talking about primary educator, it seems useful to think about the word primary or prior. The first way is to say something is first in time, and I don't think anybody is disputing that the parents are the primary educators of their children in terms of first in time. Now, it is true that normally first grade education, at least in the country I come from, is called primary education, and that's a little bit of an insult to parents because it seems to give an indication they didn't do anything before they turned up in the first grade. But I think nobody is really disputing the question of priority in time. The second way of speaking about prior is first in being, because in fact something can be chronologically not first, but first in being. A good example of that is that the father is not chronologically before the father, but the father is first in being ontologically. Anyway, small side point. If we take priority as first in being, what we're meaning to say is this. Parents at the level of their being are more educators than anybody else. They are, you might say, synonyms. To say father, to say educator. To say mother is to say educator. Education is not a role, a hat, which the parent puts on and takes off at certain moments. It's just simply what they are by their very nature. To be a father is to be an educator, which you cannot say of other agents who are involved in the process. They take roles, but they are never of their nature educators, except, we shall see, the church itself. Okay, the third way of taking prior is to talk about a hierarchy. If something is said to be the primary educator, it might give the impression that, well, there must be a secondary educator. So immediately it raises the question of a certain hierarchy. And here we touch upon, we might say, others who have a stake in the education of our children. There are other stakeholders. And these are principally the church and the state. So I want to say something about the church as an educator and then the role of the state in education. The church is an educator on the basis of two things. One, a divine commission. The Lord said, "Go ye, teach all nations." So on the basis of a divine commission, the church is a teacher. Also, the church must be a teacher because, as we've said, the final, ultimate purpose of education is that somebody reaches the beatific vision. They get to heaven. We cannot even know that is the purpose of human life, and we certainly can't know the way there without the Catholic Church. So on the basis of a divine commission, and on the basis of the ultimate purpose of education, the church must be, by her nature, an educator. In fact, she is a mother, and as we've said, to be a mother is to be an educator. The scope of this mission of the church in education is unlimited. That means she has the right in every state to found any school that she wants at any time because she, by her nature, is an educator. It also means, actually, that the church could control to some degree the education of her members. In the United States, in living memory, the church forbade parents to send their children to state schools under pain of ecclesial censure. That may seem very strong to us, but if you take seriously what the church is, it does actually have the right to do that. Well, if that's the case, then how can we still maintain that the parents are the primary educator? I think in two ways. Firstly, the parents are primary in the order of nature, not in the supernatural order. They have the first responsibility for the intellectual and the moral formation. But the principle of parents as primary educators was never meant to stand independent from the church. In fact, it only realizes itself properly in a dynamic relationship with the Catholic Church. Secondly, once a married couple have a sacramental marriage, they are constituted as a domestic church. You might say a manifestation of the universal church in a concrete place. On the basis of that, they inherit from the church a primacy in the spiritual formation of their children because they are a manifestation of the church, which itself has the primacy in the supernatural order. That just points to something of the incredible dignity that is conferred upon Christian spouses when they have a sacramental marriage. Okay, what about the situation of the state? Perhaps of more interest, direct interest to us at this moment. The Catholic view of the church in regards to the state and the education of youth is a balanced one, in my opinion. It avoids a statist position, which would say the state has the primary influence and the primary reason, the primary interest in the education of youth. and it avoids an individualistic position which says the state has no reason to concern itself with the education of youth. But the first thing to note is this: unlike the parents, unlike the church, the state is not an educator by nature. The purpose of the state is to bring about the common good. Now, this might mean it gets involved in education, just like it might get involved in agriculture or business. But the church by nature is not a farmer, nor is the church a businessman. But it might from time to time have to nationalize a company for the common good. Likewise, the state is not by nature an educator. It might get involved if the common good needs it, but this involvement is extraordinary. It is not ordinary. Further, the state has two principal ways of bringing about the common good. It protects certain things which affect the common good, and it promotes the common good. And both of these functions we can see in the state vis-a-vis the education of youth. Protective function, the state can determine certain minimal requirements for the education of children. Given that the natural purpose is that they take their place in society, I guess this would include basic numeracy, basic literacy. The state has no direct competency in matters of religion. However, that there is a God and that God should be worshipped is knowable by human reason. Therefore, irreligious or a-religious education in the state is an aberration. It is not normal. The state has some competency in moral formation because, again, it has access to the natural law without revelation. However, since the fall, this knowledge is always somewhat erroneous. And without a relationship with the Catholic Church as the true interpreter of the natural law, the state has limited competency in moral formation. However, what it clearly cannot do is command moral deformation, which is more or less what is happening in some states. Commanding the teaching of erroneous positions on human sexuality is to command moral deformation. Yep. However, the state is not there just to protect the child from negligent parents. It's there to protect the parents and their right to educate their children. In this regard, it has a particular job. There is one other agency, apart from the family, the state, and the church, which would like to have some rights in matters of the formation of youth, but it has no right whatsoever. And this is the media. The state should protect the family from deformation by the media. That does mean some form of censorship. Like the word or not, the state has the duty to protect the parents as they try to educate their children. From this, it should be, that's just in regard to the protective. Let me say something about the promotive. So not only is the state protecting the family in regard to educative matters, it should somehow also be promoting the common good through that. This operates through the principle of subsidiarity, meaning two things. Subsidiarity is a two-faced principle, if I can put it that way. On one hand, it says this: if the parents can do something well enough on their own, the state should not take over that function. However, the word subsidiarity principally means something else because it comes from the Latin word subsidium, which means help. It's where we get our word subsidies from in English. The state should not only leave the family alone in the educative process, it should support the family in the educative process. According to the Charter of the Rights of the Family from the Catholic Church, it says that it should financially support parents who choose to educate their children in a private manner. When you apply in the state of Austria for permission to homeschool your children, which in itself is a very bizarre concept, you receive a letter which says something like this: it is not forbidden to educate your children at home. It seems to me, according to the principle of subsidiarity, it should say something like this: great, well done, good on you, and here's some tax breaks to help you. Yeah, I'm serious. That's what the principle of subsidiarity demands in this case. Anyway, to summarize, it should be clear that the state can have no monopoly in education. This would be clearly wrong. It cannot prohibit home education. It cannot put forward restrictive measures for private education, saying that you have to have so many toilets of this height and all these things which would make it impossible. And there can be even another more subtle monopoly from the state. Once the state takes the majority share in the education of children in a state, it has to tax the parents at a higher level in order to maintain its majority share in the education. This means that those parents have less money to pay for private education, because if they go to private education, they pay twice for the education of their children. Yeah? In a state, a modern state, in which the majority of parents could not even consider private education for their children, it seems to me the principle of subsidiarity is not respected. Okay, but of course, the family will use other agents in order to execute its duties to educate its children. The church is very clear that while the family is a natural society, it is not a perfect society. A perfect society has within itself everything it needs to execute its task. The family doesn't have that. Therefore, it will use other agents to help it do the education of its children. What counts here is not the extent of this help from other agencies, whether it be private tutors, private schools, or state schools, but the relationship between the parent and those agents. The relationship must always be one of instrumentality. So I have to emphasize that. The question is not how extended the help is, but whether you maintain as a parent the right relationship to the other agent. And it should be the relationship of an artist, you might say, to his tools. Just as a sculptor uses a chisel, something other than himself, to craft his masterpiece, the parent will use other agents to form the children. It doesn't matter how advanced or how extensive the tools are, as long as the correct relationship of instrumentality is maintained. Okay, finally, let's be honest about this. In the modern context, the parents will have to fight, to some degree, the state in order to maintain their right and to fulfill their duty. There is a battle out there for the soul of every child, and it is taking place also through the schools. Parents will have to fight to maintain the correct position in regard to this principle of primary education. Okay, I'm still, believe it or not, on analysis of prior in terms of primary educator. The final way we can take primary is most important, because what is a priority is what is important to you. And if we take primary educator in that way, I think it's a challenge to parents. Is this aspect of your married life the most important? Does it determine your career choices? Does it determine the holidays you take, how you configure your family life, what time you get up in the morning? It's the unique mission of the parents. And if this aspect, the education of children, is not the primary focus of the energies of the parents, I don't know what is. Okay. Fear not, we're on the last section. What is the significance of this principle? So this is the place I want you to wake up on if you've been dozing. You've done well because you've been dozing with your eyes open for the most part. I've taken notes on those whose eyes closed, and we'll speak to them later. The idea of the parents as primary educator makes a cameo appearance and not much more in the Instrumentum Laboris, the working document for the Synod, which is coming up next month. It does appear, but it's rather drowned out by other, admittedly important issues. However, I think there's some good reasons to give this a higher profile in discussions about the family at this time. I want to roll through a few things, good things, that I think would happen if the principle of the primary educator was taken more seriously. Yeah? So whatever I'm going to say from now on, it's like this. This would happen, in my opinion, if we took the principle of primary educator more seriously. First, I believe that it would engage fathers more centrally in family life. Pius compares the father to God himself. I often remind my wife about that. So God creates, but we believe in a theistic God, not a deistic. He creates, but at every moment he's provident. He's guiding unswervingly his creation to its final purpose. Likewise, the Father, they generate the child, but they are called, in the image of God, to at every moment have solicitude for their child to guide them unswervingly to the final purpose of that child's life. Too often, we know in the West and maybe in other countries, the father is more like a board member or a benefactor to the family. Too few times is he involved in the heart of the life of the family. But nothing pushes this question so acutely as taking seriously the task as a father to be the primary educator of the children. I know from my own personal experience, I home educate, but this isn't about home education, it's simply about the principle of primary educator, that it has interpenetrated my life with the life of my children. Especially as they move to be a teenager, where you have to move as a parent from being a master to a friend. With my teenage children, I build part of my friendship with them on the fact that I am involved with them in the pursuit of truth and learning. It's been very useful, I think, for me to stay as far as I can at the heart of the family. Another good thing I think would happen if we emphasize the principle of primary educator is that it would raise the dignity of motherhood. The principle of primary educator turns a mother from a bed and breakfast proprietor into the dean of studies of an institute. Nay, it turns them into the student life director, the director of the program, head of pastoral services. Yeah? I think that the principle of primary educator in this way would give individual mothers greater satisfaction in motherhood, a greater joy in motherhood, and even more importantly, it would correct a societal demeaning of motherhood, because they would see the extent of the task that comes to every mother. I think it would make more sense of why we educate girls. I get asked, not infrequently, by female students, is it worth the university education I'm paying for? 4 years, all that money. Is it worth it when I just want to be a mother? Just. Wife and mother. And the answer, of course, is, of course it's worth it. Not only because the pursuit of wisdom is worth it, but when you have children and you become the dean of studies of your institute, all that education makes sense. So I think it would give a great sense to the education of our girls. I think it would change or correct misunderstandings about human sexuality. The problem of human sexuality in the West is that it's trivialized. Now, we get certain gravity, we put a certain gravitas back into it by a focus on the procreative end of the action. But what if we focus on the educative end of the action? What happens if a married couple, before having marital intercourse, were conscious of the fact that they are embarking perhaps on a 20-year project to form completely an eternal being? This gives incredible sort of gravitas and dignity to marital intercourse and to sexual intercourse in general. I think it would change the way we choose our partners. We wouldn't think, am I attracted to you, or can you financially support me? But are you the kind of person that I want to spend 40 years with forming children. I think it would change our understanding of the complementarity of human sexuality, of the different sexes, which is said to be contrived, which is said to be a societal invention. Anybody who's spent even a little time, man and woman, on the project of forming a child knows from experience the unique contribution of what is masculine and what is feminine. I think it would have a very important corrective in our society for the understanding of human sexuality. I think it would fortify the marital bond. Cormac Burke, in his book Covenanted Happiness, gives a testimony of 40 years of working in marriage tribunals around the world. And he said, the major reason for divorce between Catholics was a lack of common mission. Certainly the lack of putting children at the center, he says, because then the couple stand the whole married life face to face rather than side by side in a mission. It's hard to spend your whole life face to face. Somebody's going to blink, or even worse, turn their head and wink at somebody else. Yeah? Nothing kind of founds or absorbs a couple than to have a common mission. And the common mission to educate the children is a profound mission. All friendships are founded on a common good, and they are as deep as that common good is. The common good of the formation of children is a very profound common good, enough to found a lifelong co-mission and co-life with another individual. I think the principle of the primary educator taken seriously would bring life to the family. In Letter to Families, John Paul II gives a certain diagnosis of the problem of the family. He says there's too little life in the family. Surely he means, of course, too few persons. People have too few children. And because of this, what Mortimer Adler says is true. He says that the walls of an empty house collapse from the pressure from the outside because of the vacuum within the house. Now, it's partly to do with too few children, but even when there are children, too little life in the house. Nothing pulls back life into the house than to root the education in the house. The major activity of the children is their education. The more you can pull that back into the home, the more life there is in the home. Finally, I think it would have important societal effects. Of course, this has to be true because what's good for the family is good for society. As Chesterton says, the home is the factory where humanity is made. But I think there would be two very particular advantages. The first is this: it would cause an economic reorientation in society. Taking the principle of the primary educator seriously is very time-consuming. If it's manifested in home education, it means for sure one of the spouses will not work. It means different career perspectives, different economic hopes. It puts being over having. It's countercultural. And if many people took this principle seriously, it would be revolutionary. Finally, the principle of the primary educator stands against a wedge that is being driven between parents and children. In the United Kingdom, the department responsible for the education, until recently, was called the Department of Children, Schools, and Families. Do you see that? That the children and the families are separated by the word school. Now, it might just be to do with the number of vowels in each word. You can calculate them and see that they get bigger and bigger. But I think something else is going on in that word order. Certainly, it's very significant that in the United Nations Charter for the Rights of the Child, there is no mention of the parents' right to educate their children. Nothing. But there's not even a right for a child to be born in a family, which must be the most fundamental right a child could have, to be born within marriage. Affirming the principle of primary educator binds the parent to the child and the child to the parent. It affirms that the family and not the individual is the unit of society. But if parents let this task slip from their hands, then they will look useless, because they will be useless. And then they will be marginalized. And that's not good for anyone, because when the family is marginalized, two options: individualism or totalitarianism. And in fact, individualism always leads back to totalitarianism, because the individual is no match for the state. Only the family can stand up to the state. So, finally, a common criticism of this principle of the primary educator, especially when it's manifested in more radical forms of home education, but just generally when parents take this kind of control over the education of their children, is that it is insular, that it cuts children off from the rest of society, that when it's religiously inspired, it produces religious ghettos. I beg to differ. In my opinion, the zealous tutelage of parents vis-à-vis their children is an essential part of the new evangelization. If the new evangelization is ever to take off, and it seems to me it's still trundling down the runway in most places, it's going to depend upon the raising of a new generation of Catholics who are formed in a view of the world that is, in some respects, radically different from the one presented by society. Parents who take control of the education of their children, in my opinion, act like bishops who train their seedlings, their seminarians, in the exclusive atmosphere of the seminary. Let us be honest, we are both in the business of training special forces. Special forces are few in number, but they are highly motivated. They are convinced of the mission. They are dedicated and they are trained. And they can really help to win the war. In short, the counterattack, the new evangelization which we all desire, depends to a great extent on parents taking to heart the glorious duty and the happy duty of being a primary educator. Thank you.